She was 20 years old on the morning her father sold her to a coward. He did not call it selling, and he did not call the man a coward to her face, because Thaddeus Calloway was a man who preferred his sins dressed in Sunday clothes. He called it an arrangement. He called it a mercy for both families in a hard year. He stood at the foot of her bed with his hat already on his head, which was not a thing he did, and he told her that she would marry Silas Vane before the church bell rang 6 that evening, and that the matter was settled, and that she would thank him for it inside of a year. Josephine Calloway did not answer him at first. She lay looking at the ceiling of the room she had slept in her whole life, at the water stain shaped like a running horse that she had named as a child and never told anyone about, and she thought that there ought to be some ceremony to the ruining of a life, some thunder or some silence, and that instead there was only her father standing in the doorway with his hat on, smelling of the barn, telling her to be dressed by 4. What nobody in the house that morning understood, not her father, who believed he was trading his daughter for 200 head of cattle and the clearing of a note that would otherwise have put them all in the road by spring, and not the 2 younger brothers eating their breakfast without looking up, who had learned already not to ask questions when their father wore his hat indoors. Was that the man they had all agreed to call a coward had not drawn a pistol in earnest in 4 years, for a reason none of them had troubled themselves to learn, and that before the following sunrise, that reason would walk into Widow's Bend on 11 horses, and that the town which had spent 4 years laughing behind its hand at Silas Vane would spend the rest of its life speaking his name the way other towns spoke of miracles. Settle in, because this one runs long and it earns every minute of it. And before we go any further, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. The girl who learned to count Josephine Calloway had been born in the back room of a trading post on the Cimarron Road, the second of 4 children and the only girl, to a mother named Eleanor who died bringing the last of them into the world when Josephine was 9 years old. She did not remember her mother's face with any clarity by the time this story finds her, 20 years old, dressed in a stiff gray traveling dress that had been her mother's, standing in front of a mirror too small to show her whole reflection at once. But she remembered her mother's hands, which had been quick and certain over a ledger book, and she remembered being lifted onto a stool at the trading post counter at an age when other children were still being told not to touch things, and being taught to count coin. Her mother had run the books for the trading post the way some women ran a household, which was to say completely and without complaint, and without anyone in the family understanding, until she was gone exactly how much had rested on her narrow shoulders. Eleanor Calloway had taught her daughter the value of $1 before she taught her the alphabet, because a family living hand to mouth on a wagon road had more urgent uses for arithmetic than for poetry, and Josephine had absorbed the lesson the way a child absorbs anything taught with love, which is to say permanently. After Eleanor died, Thaddeus Calloway did not remarry. He was not a cruel man in the ordinary sense that the word is used. He did not raise his hand to his children, and he worked from dark to dark, and he had buried a wife and grieved her honestly in his own closed-mouth way. But he was a frightened man dressed in the clothes of a stern one, and frightened men make frightened decisions, and over the 11 years that followed, Thaddeus Calloway made a great many of them. He bought land he could not afford in a year the rain did not come. He borrowed against cattle that did not survive a winter nobody had predicted would be so hard. He signed notes he did not fully understand at the bank in Prescott because the banker, a soft-spoken man named Elias Whitcomb, had a way of making debt sound like opportunity, and Thaddeus, grieving and proud and unwilling to ask his own daughter for help with the numbers she had inherited from her mother, signed where he was told to sign. By the time Josephine was 17, she understood the shape of her family's finances better than her father did, not because he had shown her the books, but because she had gone looking in them one evening while he slept. In the same quiet and unapologetic way, she had once gone looking in her mother's mending basket for a spool of the right color thread. She had sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open in the lamplight and done the arithmetic twice to be sure of it, and she had understood, with the flat and unsentimental clarity her mother had given her, that the Callaway Ranch was 2 bad seasons from belonging to the bank outright, and that her father either did not know this or could not bring himself to know it. She had said nothing. This was, she would come to understand later, the great failure of her girlhood, not a failure of arithmetic, at which she had never once failed, but a failure of nerve, the same failure of nerve that made her wince every time she thought of it in later years. She had closed the ledger and put it back exactly as she found it and gone to bed, because she was 17, and because her father was a proud man who wore his hat indoors when he did not want to be questioned, and because she did not yet know that silence, applied often enough, becomes its own kind of debt. 3 years later, on the morning her father stood in her doorway with his hat on and told her she would be married by 6 o'clock, she understood exactly what had happened without needing to be told a single figure of it. The note had come due. The 200 head of cattle Sela's vein was said to be bringing to the arrangement, along with the deed to 60 acres of good bottomland along Cottonwood Creek, was not a dowry paid to a lucky man. It was the price of her father's pride, finally called in, and she was the collateral. She dressed in her mother's gray traveling dress, because it was the only good dress she owned that had not been let out and taken in so many times. It no longer held its shape, and she stood in front of the small mirror, and she did not cry, because her mother had never once cried in front of her in 9 years, and Josephine had decided somewhere along the way, without ever announcing the decision to anyone, that she would live the same way. One small act of defiance she did allow herself. She took the mending kit her mother had left her, needles and thread, and a folding pair of shears with bone handles worn smooth by use, and she sewed it, that morning, into the lining of her traveling coat. In a pocket she made herself with quick, certain stitches, so that whatever else the day took from her, she would still own the one thing that was hers by inheritance rather than by arrangement. The night before the wedding, Josephine sat up late at the kitchen table with her mother's ledger open in front of her, though there was no accounting left to do in it that mattered. To the arrangement, the note was settled, the cattle counted, the deed already drawn, and she found herself instead simply running her fingers down the columns of her mother's handwriting, the careful figures Eleanor Callaway had kept for a trading post that had long since changed hands, as though there were some answer written in the old arithmetic that might tell her how to carry herself into a marriage she had not chosen, and could not, by any honest accounting of her family's position, refuse. Her youngest brother, Daniel, 11 years old and too young to fully understand what the household had lost or what it was about to gain, came and stood in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt and asked her, in the blunt way of children who have not yet learned to soften a question, whether she was frightened of marrying a coward. Josephine considered the question with the same care she gave any figure that did not immediately balance. "I don't rightly know what I'm frightened of yet," she told him honestly. "I've never met the man properly, only watched him from a distance at market same as everyone else in this town. And I've learned, Daniel, that watching a person from a distance and knowing a person are 2 very different arithmetics, and it does a body no good at all to solve for one when the problem's actually the other." She closed the ledger. "Go on back to bed. Whatever tomorrow turns out to be, I mean to meet it with clear eyes and not a sleepless head." She did not sleep well regardless, and she rose before dawn on her wedding day the way she had risen before dawn her whole life, from a habit her mother had instilled in her of meeting the day's figures before the day's distractions arrived to muddy them. And she stood a long while at the window of the room she would not sleep in again, watching the gray light come up over land that had never once, in 20 years, fully belonged to her family free and clear, and she made herself a private promise that whatever else the day took from her, she would keep her own counsel and her own arithmetic intact, married or not, and would not let a stranger's name change the sum of who she understood herself to be. The man the town called Yellow Widow's Bend was a town of perhaps 400 souls sitting at the place where the Cottonwood Creek Road met the old stage line, and like most towns of its size, it had a great many opinions about its neighbors and very little patience for complicating those opinions with facts. The opinion the town held of Silas Vane, in the year this story finds him, was simple, uniform, and, as the town would learn before the week was out, almost entirely wrong. Silas Vane was 31 years old. He stood a hand taller than most men in Widow's Bend, and moved with the kind of stillness that some men mistake for slowness and other men, the more perceptive ones, recognize as the stillness of a creature that has learned exactly how much motion a situation requires and refuses to spend a single motion more. He wore a gun the way every man in the territory wore a gun, low on the hip and worn smooth at the holster mouth, and in 4 years of living at the edge of Widow's Bend, running cattle on land his father had left him and speaking to almost no one beyond what commerce required, he had not once drawn it. This alone would not have earned him a reputation. Plenty of men in a cattle town went years without cause to draw a weapon, and nobody thought less of them for it. What had earned Silas Vane his reputation? What had earned him, over 4 years, the name that trailed him into the mercantile and the saloon and the church, spoken just loud enough to be sure he heard it, was a single afternoon that the town had witnessed in full, and had spent 4 years since retelling to newcomers with the particular relish that small towns reserve for another man's disgrace. 4 years before this story begins, Silas Vane's younger brother, Caleb, 23 years old and hot-tempered in the specific way of younger brothers who have grown up in an older brother's shadow, had gotten into an argument over a card game with a drifter named Royce Dunmore in the street, outside the Widow's Bend saloon, in full view of a Saturday afternoon crowd. The argument had turned, as such arguments sometimes did, from words to a hand hovering near a holster, and Caleb Vane, who fancied himself quick and was not nearly as quick as he believed, had gone for his gun first. Silas Vane had been standing not 30 feet away, on the boardwalk, outside the mercantile, and the entire town agreed on what happened next because the entire town had watched it happen. Silas had not moved. He had not called out. He had not drawn. He had stood with his hand at his side while his younger brother pulled his pistol, and Royce Dunmore, faster and colder and entirely sober, put a bullet through Caleb Vane's chest before the boy's gun had cleared leather. What the town did not know, because Silas Vane had never told a living soul in Widow's Bend, was the reason for that stillness, and it was not the reason 4 years of gossip had settled on. Fear was not what had frozen him. He had frozen because 11 months earlier, in a cattle town 200 miles east called Sorrow Creek that no longer entirely exists in the way it did then, Silas Vane had been the fastest and surest hand with a pistol that 3 counties had ever produced. A young man recruited at 19 by a cattle association to ride as a regulator against rustlers, and in a gunfight outside a lined shack that had gone wrong in every direction a gunfight can go wrong. He had put a bullet through a man he believed, in the half-second available to him, to be reaching for a weapon, and the man had not been reaching for a weapon. The man had been reaching for his young son, to pull the boy behind him, and Silas Vane's bullet had passed through the father's shoulder and killed the 6-year-old boy standing just behind him. Silas Vane had not fired a gun at another human being since that day, and he had promised himself, kneeling in the dirt of that lined shack yard with a dead child in his arms, and the boy's father screaming a sound Silas would hear in his sleep for the rest of his natural life, that he never would again, not for pride, not for a card game, not for anything short of a certainty he did not believe any man was capable of possessing in the half-second a gunfight allows for. Certainty. So when his own brother went for his pistol in the street outside the Widow's Bend saloon, Silas Vane had stood with his hand at his side and let a faster and colder man kill him, because the alternative drawing, in anger, in that same uncertain half-second, was a thing Silas Vane had sworn on a dead child's body he would never again risk being wrong about. He had buried his brother on the rise north of town with his own hands, refusing help, and he had said nothing to anyone about why he had not drawn, because there was no way to say it that would not require him to speak the name of the boy in sorrow creak out loud, and he had decided, standing over his brother's grave, that he would rather wear the name coward for the rest of his life than speak that boy's name in this one. For 4 years he had kept that bargain with himself. He ran his father's cattle. He paid his debts on time. He nodded to men on the street who called him yellow just loud enough to be heard, and never once corrected them, because correcting them would have required an explanation he was not willing to give, and because some part of him, the part that still knelt in the dirt of that lined shack yard every night in his sleep, believed he deserved the name. He had a pocket watch that had belonged to his father, silver-cased and worn smooth at the corners, and it did not run. It had stopped permanently at 17 minutes past 4 in the afternoon, which was the time on the church clock in Sorrow Creek at the moment the boy had died, visible over the lined shack roof in the half-second before Silas Vane pulled the trigger, and Silas had never had it repaired, and he carried it in his breast pocket every day of his life, not to tell the time, but so that some part of him would always know exactly what hour it was. This was the man Thaddeus Calloway had arranged to marry his daughter to, in exchange for 200 head of cattle and the deed to 60 acres along Cottonwood Creek, land Silas Vane offered without hesitation the moment Thaddeus mentioned, over a bottle of whiskey neither man could afford, that his daughter had reached an age where a father in his position needed to see her settled, and settled soon. What the town did not know, and what Josephine Calloway certainly did not know on the morning she sewed her mother's mending kit into the lining of her coat, was that Silas Vane had not proposed the arrangement out of any calculation of cattle, prices, or land values at all. He had proposed it because he had watched Josephine Calloway, on market days, count coin at her father's stall with the same quick and certain hands her mother had once used, and add columns of figures in her head faster than the men around her could find a pencil, and hold her chin level when other men made remarks about a woman doing sums better than her father. And Silas Vane, who had spent 4 years being invisible on purpose, had found himself, against every rule he had made for his own life, unable to stop noticing her. He had told himself it was pity at first, watching Thaddeus Calloway's debts pile up around a daughter who deserved better than to inherit them. He told himself that a second time when he offered the cattle and the land, framing it to Thaddeus as a business arrangement between two men who each had something the other needed. He was 31 years old, and he had not permitted himself to want anything for 4 years, and he did not have the vocabulary anymore, even in the privacy of his own head, to call the thing he wanted by its right name. The wedding took place at 6 o'clock in the evening, as promised, in the small clapboard church at the north end of Widow's Bend, with Reverend Amos Prout officiating in the flat, hurried tone of a man who had married 100 couples for reasons of cattle and land and precious few for reasons of the heart, and who had learned not to comment on the difference. Perhaps 30 people filled the church, which in a town of 400 was a poor showing for a wedding, and the poorness of the showing was its own kind of commentary. Thaddeus Calloway sat in the front pew in his one good coat with his hat finally off, and his 2 younger sons sat beside him looking as though they understood only that something important and slightly shameful was happening to their sister, and behind them sat the ordinary assortment of Widow's Bend's curious and its cruel, come to watch a marriage that half the town had already decided was a tragedy dressed up in a borrowed dress. Josephine walked down the short aisle on her father's arm without looking at anyone, because she had learned as a girl that a room full of people watching you is a room you can survive by refusing to see it. And she reached the front of the church and stood beside Silas Vane and looked at him properly, for the first time that day, and found something in his face she had not expected to find. She had expected, based on 4 years of town gossip, to find weakness in Silas Vane's face, a softness, an apology, the look of a man who knew himself to be lesser and had made a kind of peace with it. What she found instead was stillness, the same stillness the whole town mistook for cowardice, and underneath the stillness, when she let herself look for longer than a glance, something that looked a great deal like grief carried so long it had become a permanent fixture of a man's bearing, the way a limp becomes permanent in a leg broken young and never properly set. He said his vows in a low, even voice. That did not waver, and when it came time to place a ring on her finger, his hands were entirely steadier. She noted with the part of her mind that never stopped noticing things, than the hands of most grooms she had watched marry at that altar, men who had never been called cowards by a single soul in their lives. The ring itself was plain, unadorned silver, and Josephine would not learn until much later, on a night that would change everything the town believed about both of them, that Silas Vane had made it himself, working the metal down by lamplight over 3 evenings from a Mexican dollar he had carried since. He was 19 years old, because he had not wanted to buy a ring from the mercantile in Widow's Bend and have every soul in town know its price down to the penny, and because some part of him, the part he did not examine too closely, had wanted to give her something made rather than something bought. Reverend Prout pronounced them married in the flat, hurried tone he used for cattle and land marriages, and a scattering of applause went up from the pews, thin and obligatory, and somewhere behind her Josephine heard a man's voice. She never learned whose, and was glad of it, mutter to his neighbor that it was a fine thing when a coward could still find a woman willing to have him, so long as her father was desperate enough. Silas Vane's face did not change at all when the remark reached him, which Josephine noticed because she was watching for it, half hoping he would flinch so that she could feel less alone in the flinching she was doing herself. He did not flinch. He simply took her arm, correctly and formally, and walked her back down the aisle and out into the last gold light of the evening, and it was not until they were alone on the church steps, out of earshot of the departing congregation, that he spoke to her for the first time as her husband. "I know what they say about me," he said, in the same low, even voice he had used for his vows. "I won't ask you to pretend you haven't heard it. I only ask that you judge for yourself in your own time, and not on the strength of a story other men tell better than they know it." Josephine looked at him for a long moment in the fading light, and she thought of her mother's ledger, and the 11 years of numbers she had learned to read with more honesty than the men around her seemed willing to apply to their own accounts. And she said, "I generally do prefer to check the figures myself, Mr. Vane, before I sign onto anyone else's total." It was the first time in 4 years, though she could not have known it, that anyone in Widow's Bend had offered Silas Vane the simple courtesy of waiting to see the sum before passing judgment on it, and something in his stillness eased, very slightly, in a way that no one watching from a distance would have been able to name. What neither of them knew, standing on those church steps in the last of the gold light, with a scattering of dry rice still caught in the folds of her mother's traveling coat, was that 11 riders were, at that same hour, crossing the dry wash 40 miles east of Widow's Bend at a walk to spare their horses, led by a man named Royce Dunmore who had spent 4 years hearing, through the slow grapevine that carries news across a territory, that the man who had stood by and let his own brother die in the street at Widow's Bend was the same Silas Vane who had once ridden as a cattle association regulator, and who had once, on a bad afternoon outside a lined shack in Sorrow Creek, put a bullet through Royce Dunmore's own younger brother's shoulder in the same half-second that killed a 6-year-old child who happened to be standing behind him. Royce Dunmore had not come to Widow's Bend for the cattle or the town, or anything so simple as robbery. He had come, at long last, to settle a debt he believed a coward owed him, on the theory, reasonable enough, on the evidence 4 years of Widow's Bend gossip provided, that a man who would not draw against his own brother would not draw against anyone at all, and could therefore be killed at leisure, without risk, in front of as large an audience as Royce Dunmore cared to arrange. The first night they rode out to the Vane Ranch that evening in a borrowed buggy, the 200 head of cattle already delivered to the Callaway. Spread that morning as agreed, the 60 acres along Cottonwood Creek already recorded at the county courthouse under both their names, and the whole transaction that had bound them together as complete, in the eyes of the law and the town, as such transactions ever became. The ranch house was small and plain, and kept with a bachelor's spare economy. A single main room with a stove and a table and 2 chairs, a sleeping loft above, a bedroom off the back that Silas had built with his own hands the previous spring, though he had never told a soul, not even Thaddeus Callaway during their negotiations, exactly why he had built. A second room onto a house he occupied alone. Josephine understood the answer the moment she saw it, swept and whitewashed and fitted with a bed frame he had clearly built himself and a window that faced east, toward the sunrise, and she understood that Silas Vane had begun building a room for a wife before he had ever worked up the courage to ask her father for one. She did not say this out loud. She set her small trunk down inside the door of the new room, and she looked at the careful joinery of the window frame, done by a man's hands with more patience than the work strictly required, and she felt something shift in her chest that she did not have a name for yet, and did not trust herself to examine too closely on her wedding night, of all nights, with a stranger's ring on her finger and her father's debts finally paid. Silas built up the fire in the main room and set water to heat, and moved through his own house with the same economical stillness he carried everywhere. And Josephine, watching him from the doorway of her new room, found herself doing the thing she had done her whole life without meaning to, which was counting the number of times he glanced toward the window, counting the length of the silences between his sentences, counting the small tells of a man listening for something he did not want to admit he was listening for. "You keep looking at the door," she said finally, because she had never in her life been able to leave a discrepancy unexamined. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Habit," and did not elaborate, and Josephine, who had spent 20 years learning to read the gap between what a man said and what a man meant, understood that it was not habit at all, and filed the observation away the way she had once filed away a discrepancy in her father's ledger patiently, without confrontation, waiting for the moment when the full sum would present itself. They ate a simple supper of beans and cornbread that Silas had put together with more competence than most bachelors managed, and they spoke, haltingly at first and then with more ease, about small things, about the 60 acres along Cottonwood Creek and what might be planted there in the spring, about her mother's ledger and the arithmetic she had loved since she was small enough to be lifted onto a trading post stool, about his father's cattle and the 4 years he had spent building the herd back up from almost nothing after a hard winter had taken half of it. He did not mention his brother. She did not ask. But somewhere in the course of that long, careful evening, sitting across a plain pine table from a man the whole town called a coward, Josephine Calloway found herself thinking that whatever else was true about Silas Vane, he was not a man who spoke carelessly, and he was not a man who avoided her eyes, and neither of those things matched the story the town had told her for 4 years without her ever once having asked to hear it. It was full dark, past 9 o'clock, when Silas Vane went suddenly and entirely still in the middle of a sentence about the price of seed corn, his head turning very slightly toward the window, and Josephine, who had spent an entire evening cataloging his tells without meaning to, understood before he said a word that whatever he had been listening for all evening had finally arrived. "Stay inside," he said, rising from the table with the same economy of motion he brought to everything, crossing to the window and easing the curtain aside a fraction of an inch. "And stay away from the lamp." Josephine did not stay inside, because she had never in her life been the kind of woman who did as she was told simply because the telling came from a man, but she did blow out the lamp, because she understood the sense of that instruction even if she did not intend to obey the rest of it, and she crossed to the window beside him in the sudden dark and looked out at what he was looking at. 11 riders, coming up the wagon track from the county road at an easy walk, dark shapes against a sky just clear enough to silhouette them, and at their head a broad-shouldered man on a pale horse who reined up at the edge of the yard and called out, in a voice pitched to Carrie, a name Josephine had never heard before that night and would never forget for the rest of her life. "Silas Vane, you know why I've come, and you know I've waited 4 years. To come to it proper. Step out here and stand your ground like a man ought, or I'll come in and take you like the yellow dog every soul in this territory already knows you to be. What nobody in Widow's Bend knew here the story asks you to sit with a fact that every person watching from the darkness of the Vane Ranch yard that night would have found impossible to believe, and that the town of Widow's Bend would spend the rest of its history retelling with the particular awe reserved for the moment, a thing everyone believed turns out, in a single evening, to have been entirely wrong. Silas Vane had not lost his speed in 4 years of refusing to draw. He had not grown soft, or slow, or uncertain in the mechanics of a fast hand and a level eye, because those things, once trained into a man's body at 19 years old by an association willing to pay for the best instruction the territory offered, do not simply leave a man because he chooses not to use them. What Silas Vane had lost, or rather what he had deliberately set down like a man setting down a weight he had decided he had no further right to carry, was his willingness to trust his own certainty in the half-second a gunfight allows for. Certainty because he had been wrong once, catastrophically and permanently wrong, and a boy had died for it, and no amount of speed had ever been able to buy that boy back. But a man surrounded by 11 riders who have come specifically to kill him, with a wife standing beside him in a dark house who had married him that very afternoon and had nothing whatsoever to do with a debt incurred on a bad afternoon in Sorrow Creek 200 miles and 4 years away, is a man who no longer has the luxury of the uncertainty he has spent 4 years protecting. Some decisions Silas Vane understood, standing in the dark of his own front room with Royce Dunmore's voice still ringing across the yard, are not half-second decisions made under fire. Some decisions are made in the 4 years of stillness that precede the half-second, and Silas Vane had already made his, without knowing it, the day he decided to build a second room onto his house and ask a girl's father for her hand. He turned to Josephine in the dark and he said, in a voice steadier than any voice she had heard from any man in her life, "I need you to trust me for the next few minutes in a way I have no right to ask a woman I married 8 hours ago to trust me. Can you do that?" And Josephine Calloway, who had spent her whole life reading the gap between what men said and what men meant, who had watched this particular man's hand stay steady through vows and through supper, and through an evening of careful, unhurried conversation, while 11 riders closed the distance across 40 miles of dry country toward his door, said, "Yes," without a single second of hesitation, and meant it more completely than she had meant any word she had spoken that entire day, including her vows. Silas Vane did not go out the front door, which was what Royce Dunmore was watching, with 9 of his 11 riders formed in a loose crescent facing it, and 2 more, Josephine would learn later, sent quietly around to cover the back in case the man they had come to kill tried to run. He went instead through the window of the new room he had built with his own hands, the one with the eastern light, moving with a silence that told Josephine, watching from the front room, her mother's mending shears gripped in one fist, because a woman raised to count her own coin does not stand empty-handed in a crisis if she can help it, that whatever else 4 years of stillness had cost this man, it had not cost him the instincts that had once made him the fastest hand 3 counties ever produced. What followed took, by Josephine's own later reckoning, and by the reckoning of every witness who told the story afterward across 100 retellings in the Widow's Bend saloon, perhaps 90 seconds from the moment Royce Dunmore called out his challenge to the moment the yard fell silent. And in 90 seconds Silas Vane changed, permanently, and in front of 11 armed witnesses, everything the territory believed about him. He did not walk out the front door to stand his ground in the open, the way Royce Dunmore had demanded, and the way 4 years of story had taught the town to expect a real gunfighter to behave. He came instead from the dark at the side of the house, low and fast and utterly silent, and he did not draw on Royce Dunmore first. He drew on the 2 riders covering the back of the house, the ones nobody in the front crescent could see, and he did it not to kill them, because Silas Vane had sworn on a dead child's body 4 years earlier that he would never again trust his own aim enough to fire first on an uncertainty, and 90 seconds of darkness and 11 armed strangers had not changed that particular certainty about himself. But to disarm them, a shot apiece through each man's gun hand at a range and in a darkness that should by any reasonable accounting have been impossible, and both men went down cursing and clutching ruined hands, and neither one fired a shot in return, because neither one had believed, until the exact moment it happened, that anyone could have seen them at all. The sound of those 2 shots brought the front crescent around in confusion, 9 riders wheeling their horses toward a threat they could not immediately locate in the dark, and it was in that exact moment of confusion, the moment 4 years of discipline and 1 dead boy's memory had taught Silas Vane to wait for, rather than the moment of first challenge that Royce Dunmore had tried to force on him, that Silas Vane stepped out from the side of the house into the open yard, and called Royce Dunmore's name in a voice that carried across the confusion with an authority nobody in that yard had ever heard him use before, and said words that Josephine, watching from the window with her mother's shears still gripped white-knuckled in her fist, would repeat to herself for the rest of her life, whenever she needed reminding of exactly who she had married. "I killed your brother's boy by accident 4 years ago outside a lined shack in Sorrow Creek, and I have carried that boy with me every day since. And I will carry him the rest of my life, and there is nothing you can do to me tonight that will weigh heavier on me than that already does. But there is a woman in that house I married 8 hours ago who had no part in Sorrow Creek and no part in your grief, and if you or any man riding with you takes one more step toward that door, I promise you, on the same grave I have carried for 4 years, that I will not miss a second time." The yard went silent enough that Josephine could hear her own pulse. Royce Dunmore had come to Widow's Bend on the strength of 4 years of gossip that told him he was riding against a coward, a man who had stood in a street and let his own brother die rather than draw a weapon, a man who could be killed at leisure without risk, because he would not defend himself even to save his own life. What stood in front of him instead, in the dark of that yard, with 2 of his own men down and clutching ruined hands and 9 more sitting their horses in a confusion none of them had trained for, was a man who had just proven, in 90 seconds, that he could have killed every rider in that crescent from the darkness before a single one of them knew he was moving, and had chosen instead to disable 2 and issue a warning, because some promise made over a dead child's body 4 years earlier still governed exactly how much violence Silas Vane was willing to permit himself even now. It was not cowardice Royce Dunmore was looking at. It was restraint of a kind he had never once, in a violent life, encountered in another man, and something in the stillness of it, the same stillness Widow's Bend had spent 4 years mistaking for weakness, made Royce Dunmore's hand, hovering near his own holster, go very still indeed. "You could have killed us all," Royce Dunmore said, and it was not quite a question. "I could have," Silas Vane said. "I chose not to. I'd ask you to sit with that a moment before you decide what kind of man you rode 200 miles to kill." The reckoning in the yard, what happened over the next quarter hour in the dark yard of the Vane Ranch, was retold so many times in Widow's Bend over the years that followed, by so many different tongues, that the story eventually acquired the polished, half-mythic quality of an event too large for a single town to have actually witnessed. And yet every soul who told it agreed on the essential shape of it, because the essential shape of it was, in the end, simple enough to survive 100 retellings intact. Royce Dunmore did not draw. He sat his horse in the dark yard with 9 riders behind him and 2 more on the ground clutching ruined hands, and he listened while Silas Vane told him, in full, and for the first time to any living soul outside his own head, exactly what had happened outside that lined shack in Sorrow Creek 4 years earlier, the rustling operation the Cattle Association had sent him to break up, the confusion of a gunfight that had gone wrong in every direction such fights go wrong, the half-second in which a man had reached toward his own son rather than toward a weapon, and a young regulator named Silas Vane, trained to be fast and trained to be sure and taught by hard men that hesitation gets good men killed, had trusted his training over his eyes and fired, and had been catastrophically, permanently wrong. "Your brother lost that boy," Silas Vane said, "and I lost the right to ever again trust myself in the half-second a gunfight gives a man to decide. That's not a debt money settles, Mr. Dunmore, and it's not a debt my dying tonight settles either, because a dead man can't carry a memory, and carrying that boy is the only penance I've got left to offer him. If killing me would bring your brother's boy back, I'd stand still for it right now and save you the trouble of drawing. It won't. So I'm asking you, man to man, in front of my wife's house on the first night of our marriage, to ride home instead, and let two grieving men agree that 4 years is long enough to carry a debt that killing anyone else was never going to pay down. Josephine, watching from the window, saw something move across Royce Dunmore's face in the moonlight that she would later describe, when she finally told this story herself, as the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent 4 years feeding a grief he no longer entirely remembers the original shape of, discovering all at once that he has arrived at the end of a very long road, only to find there is nothing waiting there that he actually wants. It was Reverend Amos Prout, roused from his own bed a half-mile down the county road by the sound of gunfire, and arriving on foot, out of breath, still in his nightshirt with a coat thrown over it, because a man who has married 100 couples for reasons of cattle and land still keeps half an ear tuned to trouble on his own road, who finally broke the silence in the yard, standing at its edge with his hands raised and his voice pitched with the particular authority a small town still extends in a crisis to its minister. "Whatever debt is owed in this yard tonight," Reverend Prout said, "I'd remind every man holding a gun that there's a young woman inside that house who was married 8 hours ago and has buried no one in this quarrel. And I'd ask that whatever is settled here be settled with words, since words appear, by the evidence of the last quarter hour, to have done considerably less damage tonight than lead." It was, by every account that survived that night, the two men on the ground. The pair Silas Vane had shot cleanly through the gun hand rather than through anything that would have killed them, a mercy that not one of them had expected, and that all of them, in the weeks that followed, found themselves unable to stop turning over in their minds, whose voices tipped the yard finally toward peace. One of them, a rider named Gil Thorne who had ridden with Royce Dunmore for 6 years, said from the dirt, cradling a ruined hand that would heal crooked but would heal, that any man who could have killed 11 riders from the dark and chose instead to shoot 2 of them clean through the hand was not a man worth dying to avenge a grudge against, whatever the grudge, and that he, for one, intended to ride home with his hand still attached to his arm, rather than test his luck a second time before sunrise. Royce Dunmore sat his horse a long moment more, looking at Silas Vane standing alone and unarmed seeming in the yard, for he had holstered his pistol the instant the 2 riders went down, a detail the town would marvel over for years, that a man capable of what he had just done chose to stand disarmed in front of 9 men rather than hold them at gunpoint, because holding a gun on frightened men in the dark was, in Silas Vane's 4-year-old accounting of his own soul, one risk of a fatal mistake more than he was willing to take even now. And then Royce Dunmore did a thing that nobody in that yard, least of all Silas Vane, expected. He got down off his horse slowly, both hands visible, and he crossed the yard on foot, and he stood in front of the man he had ridden 200 miles to kill, and he said, "I've carried my brother's grief for 4 years believing it belonged to me to settle, because grief left alone too long starts feeling like a debt instead of a wound, and debts feel like they need collecting. I don't reckon killing you tonight was ever going to collect it. I reckon I've known that for longer than I've been willing to say out loud." He paused. "I'm sorry for your brother, Vane. I hadn't heard that part of it before tonight. Man in the saloon at Widow's Bend told it different." "Men in saloons generally do," Silas Vane said, and for the first time since Josephine had met him that morning, something that was almost a smile crossed his face in the moonlight. What the town learned by sunrise word travels in a small town the way water finds a low place, without any single person choosing to carry it, and yet somehow arriving everywhere at once. And by the time the sun came up over Widow's Bend the next morning, there was not a soul in that town of 400 who had not heard some version of what had happened at the Vane Ranch on the first night of Silas Vane's marriage. The versions varied in their particulars. Some had Sela's vein facing down 20 riders instead of 11. Some had him drawing on Royce Dunmore directly rather than on the two men covering the back of the house. And one especially enthusiastic telling, which originated with a stable hand who had heard it third-hand before breakfast, and had never once let a lack of first-hand knowledge slow him down, had Sela's vein catching bullets in his bare hands. But every version agreed on the essential and, to Widow's Bend, entirely unbelievable fact at the center of the story. The man the town had spent 4 years calling a coward had, on the first night of his marriage, faced down 11 armed men in the dark, and let every one of them ride away alive, not because he could not have done otherwise, but because he had chosen not to, out of a private and long-carried grief the town had never once thought to ask him about. Thaddeus Calloway heard the story over breakfast from a hired hand, who had ridden in from the direction of the Vane Ranch at first light with his horse in a lather, and he sat with his coffee going cold in front of him for a long while afterward, turning over the particular shame of having spent months negotiating the terms of his daughter's marriage to a man he had privately dismissed, along with the rest of the town, as the safest possible match for a girl he could no longer afford to protect. A man too yellow, in Thaddeus's own unspoken reckoning, to ever put her at any real risk. He had chosen a coward for his daughter's husband out of the same fear that had governed most of his decisions since Eleanor died, and he had been, by the evidence of a single quarter hour in a dark yard, more wrong about the man than he had been about almost anything else in his life. He rode out to the Vane Ranch himself that morning, without his hat, which was a thing Josephine noticed the moment she saw him coming up the wagon track, and he stood in the yard where 2 riders had gone down with ruined hands the night before, and he said to his daughter, and to his new son-in-law, in a voice that cracked once in the middle of it in a way none of his children had ever heard, that he had arranged her marriage out of desperation and cowardice of his own, dressed up as prudence, and that he had not deserved the son he had gained by it, and that he was sorry, more sorry than he had words for. For every year he had let his own fear stand between his daughter and the honest accounting she had always deserved of the family's affairs. Josephine, who had spent 3 years reading her father's ledgers in silence rather than risk the confrontation that honesty might have required, found that she had no anger left to offer him that morning, only a tired, clear-eyed forgiveness that felt, she would say later, remarkably similar to the feeling of finally closing a set of books that had been left open and unreconciled for far too long. By mid-morning, half the town had found some excuse to ride or walk out toward the Vane Ranch, ostensibly to look at the ground where the confrontation had happened, though everyone involved understood the real purpose of the pilgrimage was to look at Sela's Vane himself, and to reconcile, each in their own private way, the 4 years of story they had told about him with the single quarter hour of truth that had finally arrived to correct it. Elias Whitcomb, the soft-spoken banker who had extended the notes that eventually forced Thaddeus Calloway's hand, rode out that afternoon as well, and stood somewhat awkwardly at the edge of the yard, and offered, without being asked, to forgive the small remaining balance on the Calloway note as a wedding gift, a generosity that Josephine understood perfectly well was motivated at least in part by a banker's sudden and urgent desire to be remembered as a friend to the Vane family, rather than as the man whose paperwork had nearly cost that family everything. She thanked him with the same level courtesy she extended to everyone that strange, long day, and made a private note in the same part of her mind that had once caught a discrepancy in her father's ledgers, that the town's opinion of a person, she was learning, had considerably less to do with the truth of that person than it did with which version of the story happened to arrive first. Reverend Prout, still hoarse from the previous night's shouting, held an impromptu service the following Sunday that drew the largest congregation Widow's Bend had assembled in years, and preached, without naming names, on the subject of judging a man's courage by the noise he makes rather than by the weight he carries in silence. And more than one person in that congregation found themselves examining their own boots rather than the Reverend's face for the better part of the sermon. The mercantile owner, a broad, talkative man named Otis Grundy, who had, by his own later admission, originated no fewer than 3 of the crueler jokes that had circulated about Sela's vein over the preceding 4 years, closed his store for an hour on the Monday after the wedding, and rode out personally to the Vane Ranch to deliver, free of charge, a set of good wool blankets for the new household, an apology dressed up as a wedding gift in the particular fashion of men who find it easier to make amends with their hands than with their mouths. Sela's accepted the blankets without comment and without visible resentment, which struck Otis Grundy, riding back to town afterward, as its own kind of quiet rebuke, considerably more effective than anger would have been. Neither of the 2 riders Sela's had shot through the gun hand that first night bore him any lasting grudge. For it, whatever the darker versions of the story, sometimes suggested in later years. Gil Thorne, whose hand healed crooked but whole, sent word the following winter that he had given up riding with rough company altogether and taken work breaking horses on a ranch outside Prescott, and included in his letter, almost as an afterthought, that he had come to think a man who could have killed him outright and chose instead to leave him a crooked hand, and a second chance was owed a debt of gratitude rather than a grudge, however the injury had smarted at the time. By the 2nd month of their marriage, the Sunday dinners that had once been an ordeal of careful silence between Josephine and her father became, instead, a standing tradition that drew her brothers and occasionally Reverend Prude himself, and the table talk turned as often as not to the ordinary business of ranching and books and the small triumphs of a shared life, rather than to the debts and fears that had once governed every conversation in the Calloway household. Thaddeus Calloway, freed at last from the note that had shadowed him for years, and humbled by the son-in-law he had so badly misjudged, began for the first time in a decade to ask his daughter's opinion on matters of the ranch's accounts, rather than simply signing where a banker's soft voice told him to sign, and Josephine found, to her own quiet surprise, that watching her father finally learn to ask for help was very nearly as satisfying as anything else that long, strange year had brought her. The watch and the ring 3 weeks after the wedding, on a quiet evening with the last of the seed corn planted along the 60 acres by Cottonwood Creek, and the ordinary business of a marriage beginning to settle into its own unremarkable rhythms, Sela's Vane took his father's pocket watch from his breast pocket and set it on the pine table between them, the way a man sets down a weight he has decided, at long last, he no longer needs to carry entirely alone. It stopped at 17 minutes past 4, he said, on the afternoon outside the line shack. I never had it fixed. I told myself it was so I'd never forget the hour. I've come to think these last weeks that I kept it stopped so that some part of me could go on believing I was still standing in that yard, still paying for it, instead of ever letting myself imagine a life on the other side of it. Josephine picked up the watch and turned it over in her hands, feeling the worn silver case, and she thought of her mother's mending kit sewn into the lining of her own coat, an inheritance she had carried the same way not for its use, since she owned needles and thread enough without it, but because carrying it had let her go on believing, in some small daily way, that her mother was still teaching her something. I think, she said carefully, that a stopped watch and a debt that's already been paid are 2 different things, Sela's, even when a man carries them in the same pocket. She set the watch down gently between them. You paid for that boy's death the day it happened, with everything a person can pay for a mistake made in good faith and terrible timing. 4 years of silence and a town calling you yellow wasn't a payment. It was just more suffering, stacked on top of a debt that was already settled the moment you understood what you'd done and grieved it honestly. I don't say that to tell you to forget him. I say it because I've spent my whole life watching my father confuse punishing himself with paying for something, and I've learned they're not the same arithmetic at all. Sela's Vane sat with that for a long while in the lamplight, turning it over the way a careful man turns over any figure he is not yet certain adds up, and then he did a thing he had not done in 4 years, which was to take the watch to Elias Whitcomb's cousin, a clockmaker who had set up shop the previous spring on the strength of the town's growing prosperity, and have it repaired, not to erase the hour it had stopped at, which he told the clockmaker plainly. He wanted marked somehow on the inside case as a private remembrance, but so that it would, from that day forward, also tell him what hour it currently was, rather than only ever telling him the hour of his oldest grief. He gave the repaired watch to Josephine on their first anniversary, a year almost to the day from the night 11 riders had come up the wagon track in the dark, with the old stopped hour of 17 past 4 engraved now inside the case beside a second inscription he had asked the clockmaker to add, which read simply, "And the hour after, and the hour after that." Josephine wore it on a chain at her belt from that day forward, the way her mother had once kept a similar watch at the trading post counter to mind the hours of a business that never quite stopped needing minding. And she found that she had, without ever quite deciding to, become in the eyes of Widow's Bend exactly the kind of woman her mother had been, quick with figures, quietly certain, married to a man the whole territory had once dismissed and now spoke of, when they spoke of him at all, in the particular hushed and respectful tone a small town reserves for the one story it got badly wrong and has spent years trying to make up for in the retelling. Royce Dunmore did not become a friend exactly in the years that followed, but he did send word twice. Once the following spring, care of the Widow's Bend post office, informing Sela's Vane without much ceremony that he had settled some distance east and taken up ranching himself, and once 4 years after that, a shorter note still, which said only that he had named his own newborn son Caleb, and that he had thought Sela's Vane, of all the men he knew, would understand why without needing the reason spelled out further. Sela's kept both letters folded inside the repaired watch case for the rest of his life, alongside the boy's memory he had already promised himself he would carry regardless, because some debts, he had come to understand, are not erased by forgiveness so much as they are transformed by it. From a weight a man carries alone in silence into a story, a man is finally permitted to tell. Elias Whitcomb's cousin the clockmaker, a quiet man named Percival who had come west for his health and stayed for the trade, found in the years that followed that repairing stopped watches became something of a quiet specialty of his shop. As word spread through the county of the watch he had mended for Sela's Vane, and what that mending had meant to the man who carried it. He never spoke of the particulars to anyone who had not already heard the story elsewhere, understanding instinctively that some repairs are private even when their existence is not. And he kept, tucked in a drawer behind his workbench for the rest of his working life, a small leather notebook in which he recorded, without names, the stopped hour of every watch a grieving customer asked him to mend, alongside the date on which each watch was finally set running again, a private ledger of his own, in its way, not so different from the ones Josephine kept for the ranch, a quiet accounting of exactly how long it takes an ordinary person to decide they are ready to let time move forward again. What Widow's Bend remembered Josephine Vane. She took the name without hesitation, the same way she had taken the whole of that strange, long first day, with clear eyes and a steady hand, went on, in the years that followed, to do for the Vane Ranch's books what her mother had once done for a trading post ledger, and did it so well and so visibly that by the time she was 25, 3 other ranching families in the county had quietly begun asking her to look over their own accounts, a small side business that grew, over the better part of a decade, into the kind of quiet reputation that outlasts any amount of gossip a town can generate in an idle Saturday afternoon. Silas Vane never became a talkative man, and he never sought out the kind of attention his one violent quarter hour had brought him, but the town's opinion of him shifted permanently and completely from that night forward, in the particular way a town's opinion shifts when a single vivid fact arrives to overturn 4 years of comfortable, lazy assumption. Children who had once been told by careless parents to look at the coward on the edge of town were, within a year, being told instead to mind their manners around Mr. Vane, on account of him being the most dangerous man in the county, and by all accounts, also the gentlest, a combination the town found it took considerable time to reconcile in its collective imagination, and never entirely stopped marveling at. He kept the second gun hand shooter's name to himself for the rest of his life, along with the details of exactly how he had trained himself, all those years ago, to place a bullet through a moving man's hand in darkness at a range that should have made the shot impossible, a private discipline he had built alone, over 4 years, precisely so that, if such a night ever came, he would have some means available to him short of killing. And he never once, in all the years the story was retold around him, corrected the town's growing tendency to treat that quarter hour as a miracle rather than as the plain, hard-earned product of 4 years of a grieving man practicing alone in a field at dusk, determined that if his restraint was ever tested again, he would have more than restraint alone to offer. On the evening of their 5th wedding anniversary, Josephine found her husband sitting on the front step of the house he had built, the repaired watch open in his palm, the last of the sun catching the worn silver case, and she sat down beside him without a word, the way a woman does with a man she has learned, over years, requires silence before he offers speech. "I used to think," Silas said finally, "that the town calling me a coward was the worst thing that could have happened to me. I've come around these last years to thinking it might have been a mercy I didn't deserve and got anyway. If they'd known what I could do, they'd have wanted me to prove it constantly, every card game, every drunk with a grudge, every fool looking to make his name off a fast gun's reputation. Being thought a coward for 4 years is the only reason I got to spend those years quiet and healing, instead of proving something to strangers I owed nothing to." He closed the watch. "And it's the only reason your father thought I was safe enough to hand you to." Josephine considered this, turning it the way she turned any figure she wanted to be certain of. "I don't think it was mercy, exactly," she said. "I think you built something worth having out of a reputation that should have broken a lesser man. There's a difference between a debt forgiven and a debt turned, eventually, into something that pays interest the other direction." She held up her wrist, where the second watch he had given her, the one with the inscription about the hour after and the hour after that, caught the same fading light. "I generally do prefer to check the figures for myself. And by my reckoning, Mr. Vane, whatever this town owes you for 4 years of misjudgment, you've been paid back 100-fold since, in the only currency that was ever going to matter. If this story stayed with you, if you sat with Silas Vane in the dark of that yard, the way Josephine did, holding her breath in her mother's shears, waiting to learn whether 4 years of a town's cruelty had told the truth about a man, or had gotten the whole account backward, take a moment now to subscribe, and to share it with someone who has ever been misjudged by people who never once bothered to ask for the real figures. Because those are the people who most need to hear how a man the whole world called a coward turned out to be carrying. In silence, the heaviest kind of courage there is the kind that chooses. Restraint even when it has every reason and every right not to. The kind that spares a stranger's hand instead of taking a stranger's life. The kind that a small, unkind town spent 4 years failing entirely to recognize, until one long night finally forced the truth of it out into the open where it could no longer be denied. And before you go, sit with this question a little while, the way the narrator has been sitting with it. What has someone called you, coward, fool, failure, less than, that turned out, when the real accounting finally came due, to have been exactly backward? And who in your life, like Josephine standing at that window with her mother's shears in her fist, chose to trust you anyway, before the world had finished proving you worth the trust? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you're willing, tell us what they called you and what you turned out to be instead. We read every one.